I'd now like to introduce our final speaker for the day, Igor Sadmimenko, Oceania Power and Utilities Leader at EY. Igor works with executive teams and boards across the electricity, gas, and water markets to deliver business and digital strategy. Igor is focused on the energy transition agenda across the Asia-Pacific region, leading clients through complex transformations that are underpinned by regulatory reform, renewables and decarbonisation, digitization of the value chain from end to end, and continuously evolving customer needs. As a senior partner and industry advisor, Igor brings together specialist teams to partner with industry, government, and utilities to deliver complex transformation programs addressing strategic, operational, and regulatory changes in the power and utilities industry. Please welcome Igor.
Thank you, Charlotte. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. As Charlotte said, that's a great introduction for me. So let me just bring my slides up. I've got a couple which I'd like to share with yourselves. So a quick intro. So Igor Sadmimenko, I lead both our energy and water business with the EY across Australia and New Zealand. And today I'll have a pleasure of presenting my views on what I think the future of digital is in utility space, and a topic which is widely covered. And reflecting on what Mike said in the earlier session with through Lex Technologies, I thought there was some very relevant topics about digitization, sort of the innovation angles, which we see a lot of organizations undertaking in the current sector. So let me kick off with a couple of sort of broad macro factors which are disrupting our energy sector. The first, and I describe those as the 3Ds, and a lot of my presentations to the industry and my clients, I started with this slide because I think it's extremely powerful. The 3Ds are decarbonisation, decentralisation, and the digitization agenda, which is disrupting our sector. Our market has been probably at the forefront of integrating renewables into our grid and giving the power to the consumers in probably over the last 5 years. I think it's up to 30% of our energy generation is as a result of either hydro or solar or wind generation. And it is fundamentally changing the mix. It's changing the way we view the grid, and obviously looking at how do we deliver services. With that, the decentralization agenda is significant. If I look at the penetration of residential and commercial solar globally and in Australia, that is disrupting of how we view the market. And what it is doing is fundamentally changing how we view these energy companies. I had a very interesting discussion on productivity agenda with a couple of my clients, and a lot of the times people look at energy companies or water companies and say, well, how do we make them more efficient, or how do we look at change in people, process, and elements? And recently I have a light bulb moment, excuse the pun, and to me the angle that most of the energy and utilities organizations need to be looking is how do you run productivity through digitization? And to me, the digitization agenda is at the forefront of reinventing how this business is actually operating going forward. So COVID had a fundamental impact globally on how energy companies are running. We've seen significant drive towards remote workforce, contactless services. There's been a change to driving different safety protocols, and there's been a totally different approach around how we treat the business partners through the value chain in the energy businesses. But COVID is almost a given now. The environment which we are interacting has forced us to change the way we think around energy and utilities. And that last 12 months has forced the businesses to go in totally different way of operating. Now, external trends such as competition and new entrants and the changes in the regulatory environment, the fact that there's consumption and revenue management that customers is controlled in a totally different ways. And there's an absolutely significant war for talent in our market. is forcing our businesses to think in a totally different way. I find these stats are something which also contributes to totally changing the way we think around digitization of the energy companies. The first one says is how do we look at the carbon agenda in our market? 7.6% reduction required decline in our greenhouse gas emissions each year until 2030 to maintain the 1.5 degrees goal, which enables us to make sure that we don't have by 2050 any catastrophic events from the environment perspective, as well as impact on the global economy. Now that has to drive a different way of thinking. ESG agenda has been so significant that we've seen a change in investment. We've seen a lot of the financial institutions look at energy companies through a totally different lens. So what that is making is forcing these businesses to adopt new technologies to monitor, measure, and proactively manage the reduction in emissions. There will be a twofold electricity consumption increase over the next 15 years. The electrification agenda in our market has been radical. We've seen consumers taking the control. We've seen the adoption of EVs globally, probably with the exception of Australia. There's been a significant change of how we view our business through an energy lens. And that is totally changing how we deal with the customers and moving towards a prosumer-based model. The investment into solar and wind globally by 2030 will be $2.7 trillion US dollars worth of investment. That is an amazing set of investment, which requires totally different way of how we view of how the digital technologies are supporting this new energy technologies going forward. And the recent piece of work which EY has done with a lot of the CEOs of energy companies globally, we've seen that it will be an investment over the next 5 years worth $500 billion US dollars into bringing in real-time monitoring and adaptive technologies and digitizing the grid. And that is whether it's electricity or water or gas networks, the same agenda is on the top of every executive which we're talking to. I usually bring this slide to a lot of my discussions because it provides a fair bit of context what's happening in the energy sector, and especially in Australia. We describe the disruption of the energy transition in 3 tipping points. The first tipping point, which in Australia has actually accelerated by 12 to 16 months approximately, is where the cost of new distributed solar generation plus storage systems reaches parity with the full retail price of grid supplied electricity. And that basically saying is that from the solar consumption perspective and people generating their own solar, there has been a shift in how people perceive and the number of installations of PVs in homes and also commercial sites to enable people to give the power, make a choice around how do they consume electricity going forward and the costs associated with that. The second tipping point, which is about where the price of battery electric vehicles reaches cost and performance parity with internal combustion engines. That is a debatable one, and we look at it as between the 2025 and 2029. That will reach parity in Australia. Although probably in the last couple of weeks, I've seen a significant shift in appetite of new entrants in the market, significant investment into charging infrastructure, as well as state governments starting to significantly consider what's the implications of that and how do you encourage that going forward. And the last one, tipping point, which is tipping point number 3, where the cost of new distributed solar generation plus storage systems falls below both the transmission and distribution costs of the grid supplied electricity. And we foresee that being by 2030 in Australia. Now, these tipping points are very important for us looking at the context of where the whole energy system is going and the design of that needs to be radically changed and how the regulations enables the system to be future-proof over the next 10 to 15 years. But the center of all of this is technology. If I look at our energy system, it's based It's run on technological advancements, artificial intelligence, the ability to forecast both wholesale prices and the network resilience, an ability for each one of the participants in the market to be not react, but actually proactively manage the energy demand and supply in our grid. Interesting study the other day, which was done in UK, and that was all about the customer expectations and how energy transition is actually driving a different way of looking at organizations which provide the services to the consumers. In UK, utilities are pretty much at the bottom of the customer satisfaction. And I'm talking about traditional utilities here, talking about the ones which is the distribution and retail businesses, like EDFs and Npowers and so on. Where retail sector, automation, insurance, and other ones have overtaken about digitization of their value chains and looking at customers in a totally different way. The interesting statistics is that there is a new set of entrants in the market. And those entrants are businesses which are starting to totally disrupt how the traditional energy companies operate. And a good example of that is Octopus Energy, Bulb, Over. They're the ones who are starting to rank fairly highly around their customer satisfaction because they're turning the operating and business models in the energy sector upside down. They're starting to look at customers through a lens of digital, enabling them and empowering them to take control of their future, of how they consume and what energy they consume, and how do they do that with all the different devices within their homes. A good example of that is Bulb Energy, which is 100% renewables retailer in UK, and what options do they give to their customers? Fundamentally, that's totally changing the way consumers look through an ESG agenda, but equally also an ability for them to structure their products, structure how they operate with the platform, and interact with those energy companies as well. So what does that mean? In the past, we described energy businesses as market leaders, predictable, stable, consistent earnings. The future of a digital utility is actually different. It's a market maker. It's the ones which are totally disrupting, right? Not in 5 to 10 years' time. They're disrupting the market now. They're looking at the consumers and partners in a totally different lens. They're the ones who are looking at services through a future and relevant lens, and actually focusing on how do they actually change the customer experience through a connected, cognitive, and automated way. Often I have discussions with the boards and executive teams where it's the question comes back: have you got the right vision versus the purpose? The transformation agenda and digitization of a lot of utilities is actually changing the purpose of the organization. It's being clear of how you interact on both environmental, consumer, and shareholder agenda on equal parts. Making sure that the digital platforms are at the forefront. And what I was talking about earlier in my introduction, where the productivity agenda, a lot of these businesses, it's not about how do you make the efficient process. It's about how do you change the way you operate, change how you innovate, and change how you work with the employees and the consumers going forward in an integrated manner with the digital technologies at heart. And that's a totally different way from looking at digital strategies and the programs of work which a lot of these utilities are undertaking. It is not about having an IT division which sits somewhere in the background and enables the business. It's about how does digital teams become as part of the matrix structure of the new businesses going forward. That is how digital is enabling energy companies to come to the next evolution around the maturity. I describe the future of digital probably in 3 factors. And that is the digital utility has to have humans at the center, innovation at scale, and technology at speed. Now, those 3 might sound like a bit of a couple of buzzwords, right? But if you unpack each one of them at the next level of detail, we often realize that anything you do in this digital strategies, digital programs or work, and is actually goes back to people. And as simple as that is that you always have to consider that on the other side of the phone call or other side of an app on your phone or an automated bot which is answering a query around an outage or something like along those lines, there's actually a person sitting, and that's really important. That's sort of the customer, employee, the human experience, especially becomes fundamentally important around how do you drive the future digital capability within your business. Technology at speed is basically driving a totally different way of thinking. And with regards to large programs, large transformations are required. However, how do you increase the speed and agility of delivering the results? And that's important, and a lot of times very hard to achieve in a big monolithic businesses like we have in Australia. So how do we change the technology innovation and sort of the delivery of the outcomes in a quicker, agile, and quicker way of delivering? Again, it's a multi-million-dollar question, but it is an important one to make sure that we are considering as we're starting to think about the next 3 to 4 years around the future of our energy clients. Innovation at scale is probably the third lens, right? Innovation doesn't come from technology division. Innovation comes all around the different businesses. I think empowering the people at sites, empowering organizations to promote innovation at all levels becomes so fundamentally important in digitization and sort of creating that culture of open focus and open innovation and actually delivering some of the key outcomes within the energy sector. It is not about how do we, it's not about how we implement a new solution around a customer. It's about how do we transform the customer journey through a new set of technology, and how do we bring multiple disciplinary teams, partners, into this teams of teams concept, which enables us to be fundamentally rethink of how do we deliver the services in our sector. So a couple of good examples globally, right? One of the biggest clients which we work with is Excel Energy. Excel is a big integrated utility in US, and they've actually turned the whole of their business model upside down. They looked to empower the customers. And, we often talk to our clients and say, well, you have to have integrated customer assets, your workforce, and all of those concepts. They've actually went through a totally different way of thinking around the business and full digitization of experience for the customer. Everything from usage to ability to schedule specific services, options behind the meter, interaction for my devices, and equally also driving scalability of some of the services which some of the commercial customers look at as well. APS, which is Arizona Public Service Utility, is driving innovation in an angle where they put reward programs around leveraging technology like smart thermostats, battery energy storage, and a grid interactive device around smart water heaters. And that is a smart way of incentivizing behind the meter devices and driving a different way of thinking of how the customers are actually interacting with the utilities. Con Edison, another good example, is starting to look at virtual games to train the employees for how do they manage emergencies around different gas scenarios. And one of the key things around that is making sure that the safety is at the forefront of this. So again, a very good example of how do you digitize operational thinking and how do you protect your employees in case of emergencies and incidents that might occur. A Dutch utility, Stedin, uses decentralized and underground self-healing networks. And again, a topic which is starting to penetrate quite a few network businesses here, but it is sort of around how do you rethink your future of your grid and look at fault identification, the system isolation, and service restoration in a totally different way, right? The self-healing networks, again, is enabled through a digital set of technologies where we bring the operational and IT elements together. And as I mentioned earlier, we see more and more startups. Well, not Octopus Energy is not a startup anymore, but it does have the same ethos and the same culture. But they are disrupting the market in it and redefining how you deliver services to the customers, right? And it is about aggregation of the services, looking at the customer, empowering the customer to make choices of the products and implementation of the products, and the ability for them to have the control around the energy consumption and how they actually operate with the energy companies going forward. So, how do we quantify value, right? And I suppose in my last sort of closing two slides and sort of discussions that there is a lot of policy uncertainty. There is a lot of momentum, however, with different energy bodies which are looking at the future energy system, right? But one of the key things is how do the energy utility companies, right, take control of their own destiny? How do they change the agenda around just the stabilization of recovery post-COVID to driving true business model change? And that can, in my view, can be achieved through digitalization and driving the productivity agenda. Now, the difference between these two graphs is fairly simple, right? You will lose a significant amount of value if you do not take the opportunity at the moment for to rethink your purpose, rethink how you operate as organizations in the new energy market, and how do you make sure that some of your services don't become obsolete and be taken over by new market entrants that are not traditional in nature and are currently incubating and coming up with the different ideas in the space. So my encouragement in my closing is that if we go back to the three principles around value creation in the sort of the digital utility, it is going back to some of the fundamentals, making sure that we're always clear that on the other side of the digital technology, they're humans. It is about the experience and making sure that the right level of experience and design has been invested into. It is rethinking how you drive your technology, and technology at speed being the fundamental principle of how you set up your teams in an integrated manner. And the last point is driving the innovation at all levels of the organization. And the concept of team of teams and driving innovation will enable the businesses to come up with fundamentally different ways of thinking. And unfortunately, if you don't look at those three levers or principles in some level of balance, the energy transition agenda, the brutal energy transition agenda, might make some of this energy companies obsolete or totally different in the next couple of years. So it's an exciting time, exciting era for us, and yeah, I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much for that, Igor. We've got a few questions already, and yeah, for any of our delegates, if you do have questions, I encourage you to submit them now. We'll start off with one that I received. So, what skill sets define the utilities who've been able to rapidly innovate compared to those who have, or maybe even still struggling? And what does a template for success look like?
Oh, that's a big question, but a very good question. I think it goes back to it's probably a mixture of skills. The mixture of skills goes back to there will still be fundamental value chains in sort of energy or water, whether it's energy, water, or gas, that needs to be there. So the core skill sets of managing energy company, water company, or gas company still be there. We can never replace those, right? What I think is important is to consider skill sets like data and machine learning, but in the context of the value which you're trying to deliver from the business. I often see organizations undertake the buzzwords of AI and machine learning, but without actually translating that to the outcome. And to me, we probably have to come back to some fundamentals. What's the purpose of the business, and where are you going forward? Which then aligns to the core value chain of the organization. And then you bring in the new digital sort of skill sets around data, machine learning, as well as automation to bring that technology at speed components. You don't need to potentially redefine your engineers to think and become data scientists. It's about how do you create that matrix structure and augment the engineering, for example, division with very good data skills, which will help them to start looking at a lot of their end-to-end processes in a proactive rather than a reactive way. So I think it's a complementary set of skills that is required rather than a unique template, if I can put that way.
Yeah, thank you, Igor. Yeah, that was a great response to a big question. We've got another one that's sort of on a similar vein, I guess. So sort of firstly, how can utilities create an environment conducive to innovation? And then as a bit of a follow-up, one of our attendees has sort of commented that, many utilities get stuck in this endless loop of sort of trials and pilots without maybe sort of making any actual changes to the business model. And so, so as a follow-up, how can utilities sort of scale up from these pilots and implement sort of different technologies or new business or operating models as part of their, everyday business as usual operations?
I've got a couple of clients at the moment which set up divisions, innovation divisions, right, which are have got a significant amount of funding, but what they struggle is to define value, right? To me, the success in the environment goes back to quick results and value, right? So if you are doing, for example, moving your asset management division from sort of passive and monitoring to proactive asset management, how do you define that value? How do you have that quick results, which will bring in sort of the culture of results, but at the same time evidence-based? I think that's important from the cultural perspective, right? If you clearly articulate the clearly deliver value, which can be either monetized or can bring an ESG outcome or can bring some type of a community outcome in a quick, rapid way, I think that's one way of sort of building that momentum. How do you industrialize the innovation? Again, it goes back to probably not hiding innovation in IT. It's probably building innovation into each one of the divisions and creating a totally different structure of how you run these businesses. So sponsorship is important. In my view, it always is up to the CEO to drive that innovation culture, but do not put that at just the tech space. Put it into your customer division, put it into your asset management division, right? And empower all levels of people to bring ideas. So I think that's a key fundamental element that needs to be brought into the organizational structures.
Thanks, Igor. Yeah, that was some really great advice there. We've got time for one more question, and we've just had a question from Doug Van Gelder pop up. So he's asked, utilities are heavily regulated, and as in all sectors, legislation and regulation are most often lagging innovation. What in your opinion will be the impact as regulators fall further behind capabilities and customer expectations?
It's a good question. So I'm not sure if the regulators are lagging, right? I think the way I see it, the next 5 years is that there will be a redesign of how our energy system will look like, right? So I think there's a lot of energy bodies and organizations which are looking at this in the moment. I don't think you can say regulation inhibits innovation. I don't necessarily agree with that concept as well. I think within each business, right, if you're a heavily regulated infrastructure business, you can still drive innovation in different parts of the value chain, right? I think it's up to the leadership and the sponsorship within the business to drive that. I would not blame the lack of innovation in a business on the regulation. Regulations is important from the compliance perspective. To be honest, even sort of the concepts of compliance within these businesses, which are heavily regulated, can be innovated upon, right? I've seen a few utilities recently do some interesting stuff in the compliance space to drive that innovation agenda. So I'm not sure if I answered the question correctly, but I think regulation is not an inhibitor; it's a control mechanism, right? It's up to the actual entity to drive the innovation within its business.
Sure. And yeah, that was, I think that was a great answer to quite a tough question. Thank you so much, Igor, for taking the time to answer those questions, and also for your presentation. We really appreciate your time and your insights today. So yeah, thank you again for being part of Digital Utilities.
Thank you very much, and appreciate the time.